Hello, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. That's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Thank you to Pew Research Center for making today's conversation possible, as well as to our dear friends at the Village Square. And now, without further ado, I am so happy to be joined today by Katie Harbath. Katie, who has been described as an election whisperer to the tech industry, is a global leader at the intersection of technology, policy, and elections. She spent a decade at Facebook as a public policy director, where she built and led the teams that managed elections globally. Today, she is the CEO of Anchor Change, and which is a technology consulting firm, and also the Chief Global Affairs Officer at Duco Experts, where Katie navigates the complex intersections of technology, democracy, and policy. She is the person people call when they want to understand how the internet is shaping the democratic fabric of our world. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. You bet. So I got to start this way. What does it mean to panic responsibly, and how do I do it?
So this is my favorite catchphrase. So I created this in the fall of 23 when it was early days AI. I mean, we're still early days AI, but really early days AI. There was a lot of panic around it. And I was trying to think of, a phrase to sort of be like, we should be concerned and we need to be thinking about the bad ways it can be used, but we can't let ourselves be consumed by this fear. And so I'm from Wisconsin, and anybody's from Wisconsin, there's a great brand called Drink Responsibly, which is not about being responsible about your drinking, actually. We're a state that's known for it. But I was doing laundry and I was like, panic responsibly. That's it. And it was a way for me to sort of like tell people that like, you don't need to feel frozen between people saying that, like, if you use AI, it's cheating. And if you don't learn how to use it, you're going to lose your job. Like, we can figure out a way forward, and we shouldn't be afraid of doing some experimentation, having the hard conversations about the ethical guardrails, having the conversations about how we want this technology. We're not putting back in the genie bottle. It's out there.
Yeah.
And so it's more about not letting yourself get consumed by the fear of what might happen, and to take more agency into at least what you yourself is doing and how you're using these tools, not just AI, but social media and the internet in general, to try to kind of figure out how you want to exist as this world continues to change.
Yeah. You know, a good friend of mine, Greg Harrison, he has been writing about how to use AI ethically in the entertainment sector. So he's been talking about, and he has a great Substack I've shared about on this pod, as well as the entertainment pod that we do. And he has an expression called human in and human out. I read a piece that you did for your Substack where you didn't use that phrase, but it sounds to me like that's largely what you do. Could you expound on how you use it? You use it so much. I mean, there was one article where you were talking about 6 different tools that you use.
Yeah.
But there was another one where you talked about specifically your writing process.
Yeah.
And it really resonated with how I go about it. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
Thanks. Yeah, so one of the first things I did, so last year, January 2024, I was trying to use AI more. I even had a little post-it note on my computer, like, can you use AI for that? Because it's such a mind shift, right? Like, it's different than search. It's different than how you use like any other tools that we had used before. And I was brain dumping some thoughts of how I felt about the anniversary of January 6th. And I was starting working on my book and stuff like that. And ChatGPT gave me a great line. And I was like, oh, I like that. And I searched and it wasn't plagiarized. Wasn't coming from anywhere else. I couldn't find it anywhere else. But I was like, can I use this? If I use it, do I cite it? How do I tell people, like, what's the ethics of using this line? How is it different than if I worked with an editor, stuff like that? So I tell that story to say about like what an example of where I started to grapple with sort of the ethics of using AI in my writing. And what I decided to do is I was like, I'm going to write an ethics statement on my Substack. You can go there now at anchorchange.substack.com. You can see my ethics and disclosure statement where I walk through how I use it for my writing process, because I will write a first draft. I'll do a voice memo. I can write down my thoughts in a lot of different ways. And then I will use a combination usually of ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini to help me to then sort that into themes. So, what are some good themes? What might a good outline be that could help these ideas flow together for a newsletter that I can then write a first draft from that? And then I oftentimes will put that back into the AI. And there I learned, like, for editing, don't just ask it to edit it and like
Yeah.
spit it back out at you. Instead, I ask it to show me the line edits. Show me
Oh,
where you're making changes. And
right.
it'll do it in different formats, but that way I can pick and choose where I want to see the edits. For my book, it was super helpful too in finding repetitive words. Like I have a lot of writing tics that I didn't even realize that I have. Like I use the word really a lot or just, or,
Just,
I
yeah.
was writing a book about the past and I'd be like, at that time, I would use a lot. And you don't necessarily realize it because it's a 50,000 page manuscript. Like, but AI helped me to find those repetitive phrases so that I could then do control find, go in and find them, edit them, and like make stuff like a little bit, vary stuff out
Yeah.
with all of it. But it was a lot of trial and error, and continues to be a lot of trial and error of how I continue, how the best way for me to use these tools to help enhance my writing, not to replace the writing that I'm doing.
Sometimes my only command is so first of all, do you have a name for your chat GPT?
I don't. I thought about it, but then I was like, then there's the ethics of like human versus robot.
So
And
interestingly, I had a conversation with ChatGPT about naming my ChatGPT because I have conversations with it. So
yeah.
it kept on saying, Corey, you know I'm not human, right? So the middle name is Henry, which is the formal name for Hal, to remind me that that it's a robot or something like that.
Well,
So
but it is interesting because I know in my car, I will turn on voice mode for ChatGPT, and I'll be like, "Hey, I'm thinking about X, Y, and Z," and I'll have a conversation back with it as
yeah,
if I were typing, but I can't. I sometimes do my best thinking when I'm driving, and
isn't it great? Yeah.
and then
Uh,
I'll have that transcript later. But yeah, no, I haven't named it yet.
okay, so mine's Ezra Henry Hart. So and sometimes I just Hart for short. Hey Hart, this draft that you gave me is way too many M dashes, man. Way too many M dashes.
The poor M dash. What did it do to deserve being like shunned because it's part of AI?
I was
I feel
encouraged.
bad
I
for
was
it.
reading a Thomas Friedman column this morning with M dashes. I never noticed the M dashes in a Thomas Friedman essay. I'm convinced that he's using, even the best of the best are using ChatGPT, at least for some editorial. So be encouraged. Be encouraged. Going back to Panic Responsibly, do you consider that a directive for the platforms, the voters, the candidates, or all of the above?
I think it's all of the above
Yeah.
in different ways of how you think about it. I like I learned so much in the 10 years at Facebook because you learn how to there's no playbooks for the decisions that we were making. We were having to deal with sort of what I call impossible trade-offs. Like it's like you're like, I don't like any of these options, but I got to pick one of them. And you also don't know what the impact is necessarily going to be. Like, for instance, I'm sure a lot of people remember Cambridge Analytica from 2018.
Yeah.
That was a scandal born out of a decision the company made in 2010 to create something called Open Graph. Like there are decisions that companies are making today that they don't know how it might be seen through a different lens 5, 6, 7, 10 years from now that could cause problems for them. And so you have to, but you can't be frozen by it because not making a decision is also making a decision in a lot of this. Whereas, or with, if you're a voter again and looking at AI and being like, I feel like I'm lost or I don't have any control, we do have agency. You get to pick what platforms you use. You get to decide what content you're scrolling, you're stopping and clicking on, and what you're looking at. And all of those are signals for the algorithm that you can actually sort of continue to retrain or think about what news outlets you're going to and stuff like that. And then I think also for candidates, like they and policymakers, like they
Yeah.
need to be constantly learning as well and having to think through how do we create policy where we don't know where this is going, like how do we want to think differently about how to create and how to create the right policy on this so that we don't like dampen innovation but we also make sure that we're not introducing harms that we don't want see as well. And all of this has to happen in real time, which is very scary for a lot of people. And I understand that, but it's just the reality of the world that we're living in. And if you don't choose to play, to get in the arena, to be
Yeah.
a part of the conversation, then you're absolutely going to have no impact on what happens.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up. The around security and legislation, part of the challenge for me to land on a clear with solid footing is that my own views are evolving. So one
Mm-hmm.
specific area that falls well within your expertise is how I've evolved just in the last couple of years on free speech. Until recently, on all of the social platforms, X and Facebook and the new ones, Blue Sky, I had a phrase. Great, basically, nonsense will be muted, incivility will be blocked, proven falsehoods and threats will be reported. Now, I still feel the same way about threats, but proven falsehoods, I'm ambivalent about. So, just as an example, just the other
Mm.
day, a buddy of mine posted something. He's a friend of a friend, actually, but it was started. Joe Biden was an illegitimate president from election night 2020. Georgia stopped the count. Just one thing after another that has had claims that every time they've had to actually stand up to evidence, like in the 60 plus lawsuits, they all of these theories have fallen apart. So I engage with this fellow just because I know him. I have a relationship with him, and it wasn't a productive exchange, but I tried. Um, but I also noted that I with Facebook now, the three dots at the top, I clicked and I saw what options do I have. Not that I'd want that post to be brought down, because where I've come now is I'm not a free speech absolutist, but I
Mhm.
lean in that direction where the best counter to speech like this is better speech. But community notes would be helpful, because this has been
Yeah.
argued again and again and again. So at least it could, but Facebook wouldn't even give me that option. The only option they gave me was to block them or something like that. So where are you on information that's been proven false again and again and again, and yet is being propagated and allowed to continue? Where do you stand on all that, and what
Yeah.
are what are good solutions?
So I think I'm in the same spot you're at, where I've generally been pretty far in the free speech spectrum. Like I don't I'm not an absolutist where everything should be allowed, but I do think that I am very hesitant in terms of like taking speech down. I think that should be a thing of a last resort that somebody should do. And in fact, when the debate was around whether or not Donald Trump should be let back on the platforms, I was somebody who was saying that I thought that he should be let back on because I was very concerned about the message America would be sending if platforms kept the nominee for president of the United States off of its platforms, the door that would open for authoritarians in other countries to come and say, hey, take down this speech I don't like. Like there was just a slippery slope. I did not feel comfortable
Yeah.
going down. Now, I do think that there's some things like child safety, particularly CSAM, which is basically child porn, terrorism, and fraud and things of that nature that companies do a lot already to take that stuff down. One of the challenges, so that example you just gave, so an interesting thing about that is, do you feel differently about that depending on the context is in, which I mean time-wise? There's a difference, I think, between that happening in 2020, like around January 6th, when like things are still like, or even before that, right? Like if the court cases were happening and you're kind of wondering who won, who didn't, et cetera, versus today when Joe Biden's already come and gone as president.
Yeah.
We have Donald Trump again. Like what, is and a lot of companies you saw change their policies because they can't necessarily go back to every single election. Like, do we go back to 2000 and people saying Al Gore won in 2000? Like, what, are you going to be taking down that type of content? And I say all this just to describe to people to understand how we would have these conversations internally about where do you draw the line on some of this. And also, most of the time, too, like if you talk to fact checkers and stuff, people got very sophisticated where you would have pieces of content that would have some truth in it, some falsity in it, or they might say things like people say, or things of that nature that they're trying to do to get around the rules of people trying to, and it just becomes a whack-a-mole, and it becomes a near impossible thing to define of what you should or should not allow. And that's if you're trying to put in stark terms of like, leave it up, take it down.
Yeah. So
Oh, go ahead.
no, please finish
Well,
your
I was
thought.
going to get into one of like there's a lot of different solutions that one needs to think about when all this. One of them that I think that we don't talk enough about is the difference between speech and reach. Meaning
Mm,
there is a difference between, for instance, somebody being able to post something on their profile, but it not going into the newsfeed. And if I want to go see what you have to say, I have to actively go to your profile in which to see it. It's not necessarily served to me in the newsfeed.
right.
And that's something that we've heard people complain about shadow banning and how much reach they're getting and all of those types of things. But there's a difference there when it comes to what we should or should not allow. And in fact, some of the things you mentioned, at least I know how it worked on Facebook, is if it was marked as false by fact checkers, it wouldn't be taken down, but it would be severely demoted. So you wouldn't see it as much in the newsfeed, and it would be shown to less people to try to mitigate the number of folks that might see it. But then there's also research that shows giving people little nudges, like telling people something that's false actually makes them dig their heels in more and makes them want to think about it more. But there could be other nudges, like you mentioned, community notes is something that people have been playing around with a lot more. Before somebody shares something that's been marked as false by a fact checker, giving a little pop-up being like, hey, just before you share this, know that this has been marked false and here's a link for more information. Or even a notice of like, hey, this picture is actually from 5 years ago, not today. Like things of that nature. Are there different nudges and design things that platforms can do to try to better educate people about what they are or aren't sharing? Because there's no universal definition of what is or is not acceptable when it comes to the speech stuff.
Yeah. No, a comment like the one that I part of which I just shared, I more often than not, I just put it in the category of this guy thinks the moon is made of cheese and the earth is flat. And, it's not really to be taken seriously. But where the rubber meets the road for me is in our elections. So if there's a critical mass of people that do indeed think the moon is made of cheese, or in this case, that the election in 2020 was stolen, any number of things can go from there. So, for example, um, Bannon just yesterday, and Trump is saying it too, about the possibility of ICE agents around polling places. So
This has
justifying,
been a long time. I mean, this has been a rumor for quite some time, actually.
we come acculturated to the idea of these masked, militarized agents out on in our city streets all over the country. Um, so that's where I'm concerned. If there's enough people still believing after everything we've been through that 2020 election was stolen, that what does that spell for the midterms and then the 2028?
So
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
hate to call this good news, but it is good news in that, like, since 2020, election officials, and I've worked with a ton of them, election officials who have some of the most thankless jobs in America, of trying to run these elections with very little funding, and they're getting harassed and everything else that is happening to them. There have been a lot of organizations starting in the 2022 midterms, working with election officials and others to do something called pre-bunking. So helping to
Mm,
get more information out there to people ahead of the polls about what the process is for voting, what it means, like what different ways that they can vote if they're worried about, if they don't want to go to a polling place, how they can get absentee ballots or how they can do mail-in ballots or other things of that nature. Helping people to understand the process ahead of time so they at least have that information if they do encounter some of those other things. I did a lot of red teaming with election officials about what to do if somebody were to show up to a polling place, if you were to have somebody show up with a gun or somebody show up and claim to whether it was ICE agents or not. Oftentimes there wasn't even ICE agents there. It was like people taking matters into their own hands. And so they had relationships with the cops, and they were practicing these things ahead of time so
yeah.
that they would be ready in case they actually happened. And so the election community has gotten much more resilient to trying to counter some of these things that are that could happen, and that have potentially happened as part of all of it. And it's going to be a constant, like there's going to be no finish line on this. Like it's going to be a constant thing that we have to do because most people don't pay attention to how the electoral process works. They think they show up, they vote, and it's done.
Right.
And so they need a lot of repetitive education every time we have an election about how this process can be free and fair, and also the auditing processes and other things that these folks have in place to make sure that you can have confidence in terms of who is actually declared the winner.
Are there specific types of threats to the integrity of the election that you're particularly concerned about?
Um, I'm most worried about the rhetoric that could come from various politicians, particularly, Trump, and what that could mean, especially like going into this midterms. This is basically going to be a pseudo presidential election. Most midterms are a referendum on the president, but this is going to be one where if it is a really big blue wave, Trump doesn't want to be a lame duck. He doesn't want to be a lame duck president. He doesn't want to have to be fighting impeachment hearings and everything else like that. Especially if the Dems, like, they're probably going to take the House, but if they take the Senate, that's going to be a real problem for him. And so what is he going to do to try to, if there is a Senate race or a House race where it's super close, is he going to be starting to put pressure on people, say different things? Heaven forbid we have another January 6th type of incident that happens. I'm worried about that and what people won't know what to believe, and it will sow discord. And a lot of people will trust what's happening in their local community, but they don't trust how elections are being run in that other state and in that other place. So how can we get more voices out there to try to at least get more counter language to also what the president or other people might be saying about what these elections are happening? We need to be supporting the election officials. There's a lot of really great activities that are happening where, like, for instance, I'm part of something at Arizona State University to help teach election officials how to use AI. How can they use AI to help better make more social media posts, more press releases, more op-eds, stuff like that to help get their communications out there. And so the red teaming and all of that doesn't stop. But that's probably the main thing that I'm worried about.
Yeah, yeah. So, and just so folks know, Katie has a long background in GOP politics. So we're not coming from, this conversation is not coming from a, one partisan point of view. I was curious about that too. Your background, having started in traditional GOP digital strategy in the early 2000s. I'd love to know what the Wild West of digital campaigning was like before the algorithms took over.
Yeah, so my first election was 2004. Well, the first election I actually worked on was 2002. Minnesota had a Senate race. Norm Coleman was running up against the incumbent Paul Wellstone, and Wellstone died in a plane crash like 2 weeks before the election.
Oh, wow.
And that's where I kind of caught the political bug because I was a journalism major and I thought I was going to go into journalism, and I caught the political bug. And then when I came to DC and started at the Republican National Committee in '03, so at the time, Facebook didn't exist. In fact, the day we're recording this, February 4th, is Facebook's 22nd birthday.
Oh, wow.
It was created February 4th, 2004. And so I was very early days. Like I still tell people, like, I sound like somebody that's like, I had to go uphill both ways in snow to get to school, but I created a website called FlipperCam, and it followed John Kerry around. We had these interns dressed as dolphins, and they would take video, and it would take all night for them to FTP the video up to a server for me to pull down. I'd edit it, and then I had to put it on Windows. I had to do high bandwidth, low bandwidth, Windows, QuickTime, and real time because we didn't have YouTube.
Right.
And so we had our own video server. It had to be for different ways depending upon the video.
It was like the horse and buggy days, and it's like not that long ago. It's crazy.
Not that long ago. And then you had then 2006 was YouTube. YouTube was where George Allen ended up having his political career ended because he said a racial slur to a tracker that was following him. And I remember that because I was having a hard time everyone thought it was just bloggers. Because remember, this is when bloggers got Dan Rather fired from CBS News for forgery. They had used some forged documents around George W. Bush and his military service. And a lot of people still thought bloggers were like kids in their basements that were doing stuff. And I'm trying to like advocate people to use the internet a bit more. And then this thing happens with George Allen. And then everyone's like, oh, shoot, how do we make sure? What is this thing? Like, how do we make sure this doesn't happen to us? Or how do we use it? And so I started getting a lot more questions from people. And then Twitter came after that. Twitter was at South by Southwest in 2007, and you started to see, that's when you started to see a lot of journalists and political operatives and stuff like that starting to use that platform. And so like when I was on, so I did the Giuliani campaign in '07 when he was a very different Rudy Giuliani.
Should be noted.
I always have to remind people of this. Like, this is still America's mayor, Rudy Giuliani. But like, I had a hard time getting the campaign wanting to be on social media because they were worried about what the comment section would say and what people would be saying about the mayor and if it wouldn't be seen as conservative enough in a Republican primary and stuff like that. And so they were still kind of old school, but you had somebody by the name of Barack Obama using it on the Democratic primary side where everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to be the nominee. And he was really utilizing social media in a brand new way. And actually likened 2008 a lot to, and where we were with social media then to where we were with AI in 2024. And then I think 2028 is going to be, we're going to see AI used in ways we can't even imagine right now, in the same way in 2012, Obama used data and digital in ways that we had never seen before as well. And then after 2012, and forgive me, I'm going through my whole book right now, like at a high level, but just lastly, I would just say another milestone I think is after Obama won in 2012, that's when we started getting a lot of global leaders and candidates and stuff being like, how do we do what Obama did? How do we use the internet? This is right after the Arab Spring, everything else like that. And you started to see just a tipping point in terms of use of social media and politics also globally.
So Arab Spring is right around the time that you joined Facebook.
Yeah.
Curious about that time. Was the vibe purely social media is a tool for liberation? And if so, when you first joined Facebook, that was, I think, 2011 when you first joined Facebook. When did the optimism start to hit the reality of platform manipulation or what have you?
So when I joined, to paint the picture for folks, at the end of 2010, Mark Zuckerberg had been named Time Person of the Year. Aaron Sorkin's movie, The Social Network, had just come out. You had the Arab Spring. You had the popularity around Obama. And we had, like, Obama did a live stream with Mark at the Facebook campuses. We had, at the time, they were called the Young Guns, but it was Representatives Eric Cantor, Kevin McCarthy, and Paul Ryan came to headquarters and did a live stream with Sheryl Sandberg. Politicians wanted to go to these tech campuses because it made them look cool.
Yeah.
Made him look cool, made him look hip, made him look like they were on the cutting edge of everything. And then it wasn't until so in December of 2015 is when the first time you had Trump really push the line on content moderation. He posted something about banning all Muslims. And technically against Facebook's rules, you couldn't talk about banning an entire group of people based upon religion or race or other protected characteristics. And that's where the start of, it's not the reason Facebook created a newsworthiness policy, but like there had to start to create policies of like, well, wait, if like, do people have a right to see what those who want to represent them have to say? Who are we as a platform to decide what speech a politician can or cannot say? Like, what role do we want to be playing? Like the precedent setting of that was quite large at the time because again we had no playbook sort of around that. And then it was so May 9th 2016 for me is a date that I think is a huge one in this story where that optimism hits reality. And two things happened on that date. One, it was the day of the Philippines election, which if any of you know the name of Maria Ressa, who ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago, she is a journalist in the Philippines, and it was where Rodrigo Duterte won that election. And she started to see how his campaign was using the internet in which to harass people who were as opposition, who were trying to challenge him, stuff like that. It was also the day that the trending topics controversy broke for Facebook. And so this was a controversy where a contractor accused the company of suppressing conservative content in a unit we had called trending topics. So you could see Twitter had something similar. Like, what are people talking about the most on that? And it caused a huge firestorm on the right. We ended up having to do a meeting at headquarters with folks like Tucker Carlson, Mary Catherine Ham, Dana Perino, Jim DeMint, like Glenn Beck, all of those folks. And that really, to me, really cracked open sort of this animosity between Republicans and tech and sort of opened up the beginning of this like latest era that we've been in and all of that. And then it really was, and then you had Brexit happen a month later,
Wow.
which was
Yeah.
a surprise win.
Yeah.
And then Trump in November. And then the Trump win is what really flipped the switch. And it felt like overnight, it went from anything tech could touch turned to gold to literally anything we touched turned to dust. It felt like overnight we went from everyone loved us to everyone hated us.
Yeah, yeah. So after I'm skipping a lot, but I'm also curious in your post Facebook time. Not too long after that, there was a big Wall Street Journal write up. One of the things you said that really caught my attention. You said, "I still believe this was in 2021, or
Yep.
maybe it was early 22 right after you, not too long after you left Facebook. You said, I still believe social media has done more good than harm in
Mhm.
politics, but it's close, maybe 52-48 and trending south." So since that time, do you think things have gotten better, worse, or mixed bag, or what do you think?
I still think it's a mixed bag. And the
Okay.
reason for that is social media has given a lot of different candidates and issues that people otherwise would have really struggled to get attention for. They were really able to get traction for. We've been able to see, like, for instance, just look at what's happening in Minneapolis with ICE, like, and the number of people being able to put it on their phones and immediately put it on the internet and to have a lot of different perspectives. Like, that's not something individual news organizations would be able to do on their own because you couldn't scramble people that quickly in which to do that. And I think that that's important that we have more transparency and understanding of what is happening. I think that the challenge with all of it has been not just on the internet, but just overall the discourse of our country, especially around politics and all that. And for me, it's really about the incentives that we're giving people. We got so addicted to being able to see the number of clicks we had and the number of views we had, and we wanted that
Yeah.
number to keep going up. And we didn't understand in the early days, like what that was really doing to us and how that was pushing people to the extremes. And it was pushing politicians where now they were like, I don't have to get along with the national party. I can fundraise on my own. I can have my own platform. I don't need to cooperate with the broader group to get things done because for me to be able to be reelected, I can do it all on my own on the internet. And we've never really grappled with sort of what those incentives are. And I worry that we're also not doing that now in the AI era as those incentives continue to change. What is it that we're actually incentivizing people to say and do and push all in the name of raising money, getting attention, all of those other things that they might want to do? So it's still a very mixed bag for me.
I want to tease this out for a second. You mentioned chasing clicks and engagement, I think is how you put it, or
Yeah.
something close to that. Now, there was something revolutionary and in fact beneficial when, say, as far back as the 2008 election. Can you describe that? But then, I mean, we could talk about the flip side of it. But first, I want to remember and reset that at first there were benefits to it, right?
Yes, and I think there are still benefits to it today. I mean, like for instance, like before we would put out a press release or you put out a TV commercial, and the only way you can know its impact is by doing polling and
Yeah.
understanding what like it, and that's super expensive. Now you could like put videos up on Facebook or YouTube or something, and you can get a sense of which ones are more popular that then you can put, more paid money behind and stuff like that. And so I'm not again, we need to be careful about saying every something is all good or all bad. And so I like to there's nuance to all of this, right? About what it looks like. But I think that my problem is we don't talk enough about what are those trade-offs that we're talking about here and how do we want to be cognizant of those and what should the reward system be. We've just kind of allowed it to continue to propagate like happen
Yeah.
because it's a really hard question to answer, and I don't think there's any one particular solution to it, but I also just think the fact of having awareness that it's happening is also super important.
Yeah. So circumventing the substance or trying to trick the algorithms to get those clicks has exacerbated some problems that have been festering for a long time. In particular, divisiveness. We've talked a lot on this program Denver Riggleman wrote a book about it actually, how folks get a chemical reaction
Yep.
similar, if not exactly the same as taking a hit of crack. To certain types of engagement that they have online, um, and yeah, again, like I just don't know. I don't know how to solve it. I don't know if whether it's an elected official or just in personal interactions, is just admitting it the first step. Like how do we get better? How do we figure it out?
I think that's one thing. I think too, like I'll be very curious to see like will things become a bit more local as like part of the problem too is we've nationalized everything. And so like when I go home to Wisconsin, like people are not talking about politics as much as we think that they are. Like I see Republicans and Democrats like they're going and getting beers together, they're going to the school board meetings, like they're living their lives. Like I feel sometimes like especially on the coast we get into our bubbles and thinking that everybody is kind of talking about this stuff all the
Yeah.
time, and it's not necessarily the reality of the reality of the situation. I also think too that there's one idea I have that like it's not very Republican of me, but like I think like from a fundraising perspective, it could be very interesting being like you can only raise money from the district or the area that your voters are actually from. So instead of being able to like raise money from the entire United States, if I'm running for Senate in Wisconsin, I can only raise money from Wisconsin,
Oh wow.
or something like that. Like
Yeah.
to try to think about how do you again bring it more local to what matters most to the people in your district or in your state versus nationwide and what that looks like. I also think too that like it's there's not going to be this took us a long time to get here. It's going to take us a long time to evolve into something new, but we're not going back to the way it was. Like we can't think that we're going to and there were bad things about the way it was in the past too. So I think the question is like what world do we each want to see for ourselves? And then how can we each individually model that sort of behavior that we want to see elsewhere? And hope that collectively that can continue to build out and be something that works. But we're going to ramble. Let me just say one last thing. We need to also like, I worry too, particularly like we're living in very different media ecosystems. Like how I see folks like communicating on the right versus communicating on the left
Yeah.
are just two very different things. And I feel like the left has not fully grasped like how different the communication environment is and how like thinking about influencers and where YouTube is and stuff like that. But it's also the message, what they're saying. Like oftentimes I see folks on the left going immediately to the tactics and being like, oh, we got to change our tactics. Yes, that's important, but also the messages that you were giving to people clearly didn't resonate either. And so, how do we continue to evolve? And I'll be so curious to see how the candidates for the 2028 presidential continue to position themselves to see if anybody manages to grab traction that's sort of more of an underdog than somebody who's at the front runner right now.
Yeah. One of the things that we don't talk about as much, I mean, we do inside of like content creators, entertainment people who are trying to reach out to all different audiences, is how different Twitter is from Facebook. Facebook is from
Mm-hmm.
from even IG and other Meta platforms.
Yep.
How that's different from Substack, and even the same person behaves differently. Like I behave differently when I'm on Twitter or TikTok versus when I'm on Substack. I've been kind of oversimplifying it, but like my Substack friends actually read the articles. So, but
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot too, because I mean, literally right now on my whiteboard, I have because I like podcasts, like podcasts are audio, they're video, they're text, they're all of this stuff. And
yeah,
people consume information when they're in different modes, right? So like people will do audio when they're doing something else. They're driving, they're walking, they're doing the dishes, whatever it might be, right? Video is a huge consumption, right? YouTube is basically TV now. So like I saw the Kelly Clarkson show is going to end. We got Stephen Colbert ending. The next biggest daytime and late night hosts are going to be on YouTube. They're not going to be, I think, on broadcast TV. But then you're going to still need text and you're going to start seeing websites be super text heavy because they need that in order to train the large language models. That's going to be where the AI is going to be pulling from, is going to be from a text-based system. And so we're going to be seeing a shift and continue to see a shift of the formats of content that are being created and how they're being created, depending upon what systems they're feeding into and how they all interoperate.
What do you think? Some of the things that legacy media or DC insiders consistently get wrong about how social media actually affects our brains, affects a voter's brain and habits?
Well, I think one is that assuming anything that you see on these platforms is representative of what everybody thinks and is doing. Like, I kind of thought it was interesting. Vivek Ramaswamy, sorry, I just totally butchered his last name, wrote an op-ed in, I think, at the Wall Street Journal recently about how he was getting off Twitter because he was like, turns out Twitter is not completely representative of what the people in my district think. And I'm like, well, no shit. Like, use it as a data point, but don't use it as the whole thing that you're basing all of this off of. So I think sometimes like people think like, oh, what I see on Twitter or what I see in social media is like the entire story. Like, you still got to get out there and talk to people. You still got to get out there and kind of understand what people are thinking and saying, because they are not living their entire lives, and they're probably thinking differently or acting differently on them than what they are on these. I think the other thing that's changing, but is a slow change, is just institutions. Like, people are wanting to follow less that it's like, oh, the New York Times or, today the Post had a ton of layoffs and stuff like that. And it's more who the reporter is. Who is it that I'm talking to? Who do I have a relationship with? Like, I'm very glad that for some people, I know that when something breaks on Facebook or something happens with tech, people are coming to me because they're like, Katie, what do you think? Because I've built up a relationship with them that they want to know what I'm thinking about on this topic to help inform them of like, and I'll be like, oh, also go talk to these people, or here's folks who might think differently than I do, stuff like that. But I think that they want human beings that they can build a relationship with and trust, versus it being before where it was like, well, if the New York Times says it, then it must be true, type of thing. And so I think you're going to start seeing more and more reporters and other experts and influencers and stuff continue to keep building up their own platforms. And then the question is going to be, from a communication standpoint, if you're a campaign, that you're going to maybe more likely go to an independent journalist, maybe on Substack or on YouTube, than you are necessarily going to do the traditional, let's say, 60 Minutes interview or something like that.
Yeah. There's so much more I wanted to talk to you about. Part of which is you've traveled the world and you've learned about other fledgling democracies and semi-mature democracies. I'm curious if you see the U.S. As an outlier, or are we seeing a preview of what happens when a whole culture or whole society's trust architecture collapses? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, 100%. So first, how the U.S. runs its elections and does its politics is unlike anywhere else in the world. It is the exception, not the rule, in many different ways. One, the amount of money that's in our elections. Two, how decentralized our election administration is. Most countries do have their elections are run by a national election commission. It's not state by state or anything like that in the same way that the U.S. is. We're one of the few countries that has 2-year cycles for elections. So we're almost perpetually always in an election cycle. And then also, if you look at a lot of the polling and stuff like that, the US is amongst the more polarized and more negative in terms of the future of democracy than what you're seeing in other countries. And their systems are like, most of them are parliamentarian, meaning that like it'd be almost as if here in the US, the Speaker of the House became Prime Minister.
Mm.
is basically how it works in those systems. And so there you're voting for a party, you're not voting for an individual. And so that changes how you do campaigning. So you might know who's going to become PM, but you're not going and voting for my member of parliament, you're not voting for Katie Harbath, you're voting for whatever party, like Labor, Conservative, liberal, whatever it might be, that you're doing. And so it changes the dynamics of how people think about who they're voting for and what those issue platforms are. Also, most other countries have super short election cycles, so they're like 6 weeks. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
They're
Flash
not
elections.
they're not multi-year like our presidential already is, and it's
Yeah.
going to be a two-year cycle. And then also some of them have these what are called blackout periods. So there'll be a period of, and most of them are 24 to 72 hours. France is the longest at like 3 months, where the campaigns can't do any ads. They can't, like, the news organizations can't do any polling. Like, there's an entire no talking of the election for a couple of days before the actual election happens.
That would be the equivalent of you might have been, well, no, 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 you weren't too young. Yeah, but the days after 9/11, it was
Yeah.
so quiet because there were no planes in the air.
Yep.
So it would be sort of the political equivalent of that. Like, what do I do with myself? you know?
Well, it's been like COVID too, right? Like there was, like they were talking about like dolphins started coming into, what was it, Venice and stuff like that. It was very quiet.
Yeah.
But it was meant to, for a few things. One, their theories are that it doesn't allow for somebody to throw a rumor or a falsehood out there that there isn't time to correct it into the ecosystem. But it was also meant to be a contemplative time for voters to kind of decide who it is that they wanted to vote for.
Something else I was super curious about: National Conference on Citizenship.
Mhm.
Could you tell us a little bit about NCOC? How did you first get involved, and what is it all
Yeah.
about?
So, National Conference on Citizenship is a congressionally chartered nonprofit that was created after World War II, where members of Congress were worried that as the war ended, people would be less civically engaged in their communities now that the war was over. And so they wanted to keep encouraging people to be a part of their communities. And so it was created to be sort of a gathering place, a hub. We do a national, annual conference of different organizations from around the country that are civically minded. It's taken a lot of different formations over the decades. I first got asked to be on the board right before COVID. It was like 2019, 2020. I joined the board, and then I became board chair in 2023. Yes. And 2022 or 2023. And since then we've done a lot on, we have something called the Civic Health Index, where we work with different cities and states, and we use census data of looking at how much people volunteer in their communities, their vote, like how many people vote, like what the voter turnout is, and other indicators that they have to kind of measure the civic health of your city or your state. And so we'll help them to do those types of reports. We do a lot on other data around, there's something we had called Pandemic to Prosperity, about how people are sort of recovering from COVID and all of that, and how we could use data for that. There's another new thing that we're just trialing called the American Conversation Project, where we want to be going into different places around the United States and sort of having conversations with people across the political spectrum, to demonstrate to people how you can have these conversations with folks that disagree with you, and you can do it in an in-person way and not necessarily online. And so how do we start to, again, demonstrate ways for people to disagree civilly and try to find areas of commonality?
I'd love to talk more about that because that's right. I mean, that's right in our wheelhouse. What we've been trying to do, a lot of folks ask what the mission is here, and it's basically we're pretty, we have a clunky long title, but it's basically what we're trying to
Yeah.
do. So it's super encouraging. I mean, measuring civic health in really concrete ways, and it's especially important because so many folks feel increasingly like that the world is increasingly fragmented especially when it comes to our politics. So um, we will keep in touch. But that especially is of great interest. And any way, now I'm sort of talking to you offline, but we're we're recording this. But in all seriousness, our platform is not as expansive as the Bulwark and the Dispatch and some of these other big ones, but we do have a decent footprint. So any way that we can use our platform to have conversations, or to advance the mission of National Conference on Citizenship. Man, I'd love to, because what I've learned about it so far is just super encouraging. Um, which leads me to it's a good segue actually to our TPNR question. Um, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences,
Hmm.
especially when those people are existing, as we've talked about, in entirely different algorithmic reality than we are?
Yeah.
How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
Oh, I think it's 100% possible. I am so blessed in that I have my Facebook feed is actually full of people from the right and the left. I am engaged in rooms with a lot of different people of all different stripes, from my dad's hunting buddies that I go duck hunting with to the folks in Silicon Valley and Hollywood and all of that. And I do think like I really enjoy having those conversations, but it has taken work for me, and I've worked with a great coach around this that helped create a program called Loyal Antagonists to help people think about how do you build relationships with people that think differently than you and build trust, even though you're not necessarily asking them to change what they view their viewpoints are, but how do you build trust that you can at least have the conversations and understand where they're coming from. And one of the first things I really had to learn and continue to hone is really listening to somebody, listening not as they're talking, thinking about what am I going to rebut it with,
Right.
but really listening. And then I found too that I love asking questions. So like, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Can you tell me more why you think that? And then I'll sort of be like, and then I kind of repeat it back to them, right? Of like, did I hear you right on that? Can
Yeah.
I share with you a bit about what my experience was, or like what sort of how I'm seeing it? And like I had this happen at Facebook where like the number of people at the company would pull me aside and they'd be like, I'm a Republican too. And I'm like, okay, that's okay. Like we can talk about that. But then I'd also have folks who were like, will you talk to me about gun control and like help me understand like all I talk to is people who think like I do. Like help me understand where the right comes from this, or where how I stand, because I'm a hunter. I own guns, but I'm also like, if you want to make me have to do an annual certification process or something to make sure I'm handling it safely, like I had to go through hunter safety. I had to do all this stuff. My dad brought me up with like very strict rules about how you handle guns and everything like that. And I find that people want to have those conversations, but they want to do so in a way that they don't feel judged. And
Yeah.
so I try to find a way to approach it with more curiosity, and then just more of sharing my perspective versus necessarily like trying to change their minds right away, but also to share just a differing viewpoint, or like what my experience was in something, and why I might encourage them to at least think about a subject differently, because it usually takes a while for somebody to change their minds. They don't do it overnight. And so
Yeah.
you got to be opening that door to allow them to feel comfortable to keep having those conversations with people.
Yeah. I'm remembering conversations I had years ago when I first became a Christian. I was learning an approach to conversations called apologetics. And one of my mentors described it as is we're walking on this path with our interlocutors, with the people that we're in conversation with. And a lot of times, a lot of the work that we're doing is clearing a lot of the brush on that path.
Hmm.
So a lot of these conversations, we do a lot of brush clearing, because folks come into it, like the fellow that whose post I quoted earlier. He comes with grievance against how he thinks he's perceived. A lot of it
Yep.
has to do with not feeling respected, not feeling seen, not being understood. So if I do nothing else, I want him to know that I'm taking him seriously as a person, even if I don't take his claims seriously. But then to your point, that's a really good point, because some of the smartest, most just biggest hearts, biggest souled people like Monty Guzman and David Brooks on this issue, they say similar things, where ask questions, lead with curiosity over contentiousness. So that's really great. I have a couple more questions, but before I do, I want to give you a chance to turn the tables on me. Do you have any questions for me?
Well, I'm curious about how in the because you're in the entertainment industry and you have that sort of background, kind of going back to the AI question, like what's what's some of the more interesting ethical conversations that you're seeing happening there in Hollywood that might be surprising to people of where folks are like maybe using AI in a way, but they're worried about sharing it. I'm just curious, like what that conversation like is like there.
Yeah, so a lot of the conversations are like a lot of political conversations, they're dominated by the loudest voices in the room.
Yeah.
So the strikes that we had, the SAG and WGA strikes that we had a couple of years ago, the most prominent voices were basically anti-AI voices. Like we got to stop AI, and the ones that won out were the folks that were saying, look, this is a reality. It's kind of like, transitioning from horse and buggy era to, automobile era. It's happening. It's a matter of how do we do it ethically. So I think I'm not happy with how those strikes ended up, and I'm especially not happy with how long they lasted. But within the sectors that I'm most familiar with, in particular entertainment advertising, the it's a balance between using the tools that are available to the agencies and the studios um, without stripping away the humanity of the creative
Hmm.
process. So I think that's a really interesting conversation because as much as everybody I know that owns an agency or leads a big marketing team or a production team, everyone takes a lot of pride in creating opportunities for people. But at the same time, if folks are grasping too tightly onto the notion, like a sense of entitlement. I'll give you one specific example. Writers that I know, in particular, writers in the entertainment advertising industry. There are some writers who are really great concept people and they can distill big ideas and, 120, 150-page scripts down to 3 words that really brand the intellectual property. They're great concept people. Then there are other writers who are great at volume. They take the concepts and they do, a dozen versions of a 30-second spot, a dozen versions of a 2.5 minute trailer, a dozen versions of a 6-second bumper. Um, I think those folks, the volume folks, that lean too much on volume and not enough on concept, are endangered right now. I hate to be that candid about it, but that's just the reality because that's ultimately what tools like ChatGPT can do and other creative tools. So I'm encouraging my friends you know, to learn the tools. Okay, so when I first entered the industry, I was a little bit more on the design side.
Yeah.
Um, Out in LA, my day job, I was like an account executive for a temp agency that represented graphic artists. So it was at a time when Mac was coming out with Photoshop and Cork was a thing back then and Illustrator.
Oh yeah.
There are a lot of folks who are holding really tightly onto literally cutting and pasting.
That's how I did my student newspaper until
Yeah,
I'm the one that helped, me and a bunch of others, we helped digitize our student newspaper. We used to cut and paste. Yep.
yeah. And listen, there's still a place for fine artists that literally cut and paste right now, but they don't have production jobs, and that was that happened throughout the early to mid 90s. So folks that had that foundation in their training of tactically cutting and pasting is all great, but it was a foundation to learn how to use the tools that
Yep.
were available to them. I think we're in a similar place now. I don't know if it's exactly analogous, but it feels to me like we're in a very similar place now. That's a really great question. Nobody's asked me that before. I want to make sure to ask you about your book. When's the book coming out?
Yeah, so the book's coming out this fall, probably either mid-September, no later than early October. But it's called Disrupting Politics, a front row seat at the collision of technology and democracy. So it's my story, starting in the early 2000s, going through the tech CEOs sitting at the inauguration in 2025, about everything kind of that we were talking about, like the early days of social media and politics and campaigns, my 10 years at Facebook and everything that we went through. And then the last 5 years, as we've seen things like like Elon Musk taking over Twitter, the conversation about Trump getting back on the platforms, the advent of AI, and sort of what are some of the lessons learned. It's really interesting to read all of it from a 25-year period in one sitting, to see patterns and stuff that kind of connect going that far back, around everything. And also, are there some lessons we can learn as we go into this next era?
Well, definitely, I'll have to be in touch with your publicist and we'll have you back on the program again. But I hope we talk before then. In fact, I'm going to be in DC mid-March, I want to say. So
Yeah,
lunch
let
or
me know.
drinks or something,
Yes.
because I want to continue the conversation. Also, I want to make sure, Liz, I've been really enjoying your Substack. So how can folks follow you, find more information about Anchor Change and all the great work that you're doing?
Yeah, so the Substack is anchorchange.substack.com. And then you can find me, Katie Harbath, on all the socials, LinkedIn, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, you name it. I'm probably on it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, gosh, I want to bend your ear about you have a Substack coach. That really, perked my ears. So we
There's a
covered
coach for everything.
there
And when you're a
is
solo entrepreneur like me, like I had to find different ways of different people to help bounce ideas off of, because otherwise it's just me and my little guest room office that had turned during COVID. And so it's been really interesting to see how different people have been able to create niche careers out
yeah.
of different platforms and different things that people are trying to do.
I've been loving Substack. I mean, it's such a breath of
Yeah, me
fresh
too.
air. But I really dove into it just a few months ago. Been enjoying the writing process, and I'm learning now about. I was on my first Facebook Live with Joe Walsh a couple weeks ago. That was fun. So I'm learning so much, but I know I have to learn a lot more. I'm a geek when it comes to the podcasting thing, and have been going to trade shows for this thing for half dozen years or more. But I feel like because I get the same juice going on
Yeah.
Substack as I did when as I'm in podcasting. So I really want to dive into that and learn a lot more. I might want to bend your ear about
Happy
your
to do
coach.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, we did cover a lot, but is there anything important we haven't discussed you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think I would just really encourage folks to remember that they do have agency when we're thinking about the internet and our information ecosystem. I try to do on an annual basis my own little news audit where I'm like, am I actually reading the sources that I want to be reading across the political spectrum, both in the United States and globally? For me, it's tech and politics, but I think it's always worthwhile to take a beat and kind of be like, what do I want to be consuming? And does my behavior actually match that? Or do I need to change that? Because we do have control over how we are spending our time and attention. And I think it's important that we remember that as we go into the next 4 years are going to be, I'm sorry to tell everybody, very crazy and very politically contentious. And so we are all going to have to find different ways to ground ourselves in a way to get through all of that.
Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate that. I appreciate, like I said, this feels like the beginning of an ongoing conversation. So Katie, thank you so much for joining me today and for, for all the work that you're doing.
Thanks for having me.
You bet, you bet. And as always, we'd like to thank Pew Research Center for making today's conversation possible. And we're grateful for our dear friends at Village Square for coming alongside us in this work. We have links in the show notes so you can look up Pew Research and Village Square and see all the great work that they're doing as well. If you dig what we're doing, engage with us on any of the socials like Substack. I'm easy to find at Corey S. Nathan at Corey, S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan. Don't forget to subscribe everywhere and join the conversation. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.